She fired her toxic arrows to end him, but the human turned them against her. The abandoned steel mill stretched across the valley like a rusted skeleton, its broken smokestacks clawing at the gray Portland sky. Rain drummed against corrugated metal roofing, creating a symphony of white noise that would mask any sound, including the whisper of death. Lyra Nightshade Chen crouched on the catwalk of the old blast furnace, her carbon fiber bow drawn tight. Below, her target moved through the maze of defunct machinery with casual confidence. Marcus Kane, former Army Ranger turned whistleblower, had no idea that his decision to expose corporate war crimes had painted a target on his back. The contract was simple: eliminate Kane before he could testify before Congress next week. The payment would set Lyra up for life, enough to disappear from the underground world of corporate assassinations forever. She'd been the ghost in 17 different cities, the shadow that left no trace. They called her Nightshade because her arrows were tipped with a neurotoxin of her own design, paralysis followed by cardiac arrest, untraceable after 12 hours. Through her scope, she watched Kane examine an old conveyor belt, completely unaware of the crosshairs centered on his chest. His military bearing was still evident despite the civilian clothes, jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt that made him look more like a mechanic than a target worth 6 figures. Lyra's finger found the release. She'd made this shot 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. The wind was still, the distance was perfect, and her neurotoxin had never failed. She exhaled slowly, feeling her heartbeat steady to that familiar rhythm of impending death. But as she released the string, something impossible happened. Kane bent down to tie his bootlace at the exact moment the arrow would have pierced his heart. The projectile sailed over his shoulder and shattered against a concrete pillar, the neurotoxin hissing as it ate through the stone. For the first time in her career, Lyra had missed. Kane's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the shadows, until they locked onto hers with the precision of a man who'd survived too many ambushes to count. Time slowed as she watched him reach behind his back, not for a weapon, but for something that glinted silver in the dim light. The throwing knife spun through the air with deadly accuracy. Lyra twisted away, but the blade caught her shoulder, spinning her off the catwalk. She crashed through a stack of old pallets and hit the concrete floor hard, her breath exploding from her lungs. Before she could recover, strong hands were pulling her upright. She found herself staring into storm-gray eyes that held no malice, only a weary kind of understanding. "You're bleeding," Kane said simply, nodding toward her leg where her own arrow had somehow ended up embedded in her thigh during the fall. The neurotoxin was already working, making her limbs feel heavy and disconnected. "Should have let me die," she managed through numb lips. "Probably," he agreed, hefting her over his shoulder as her vision began to blur. "But then I'd have learned nothing about who wants me dead badly enough to hire the best." As consciousness faded, Lyra's last coherent thought was that she'd finally met someone more dangerous than herself, not because he could kill her, but because he'd chosen not to. Lyra woke to the smell of coffee and something that might have been soup. Her body felt like it had been hit by a truck, but she was alive, which was more than she'd expected after her own neurotoxin had entered her bloodstream. She was lying on a camp bed in what looked like an old supervisor's office, its windows overlooking the mill floor where she'd fallen. Marcus Kane sat at a makeshift desk, typing on a laptop with the focused intensity of a man racing against time. He'd cleaned up since their encounter, fresh clothes, shaved face, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes periodically swept the room for threats. "The antidote works faster if you don't fight it," he said without looking up from his screen. "You had an antidote. It wasn't a question." The realization hit her like a physical blow. "I had 3 different ones, actually. Neurotoxin, cardiac inhibitor, and hemorrhagic agent. Your reputation precedes you, Nightshade." He finally turned to face her, and she saw something unexpected in his expression: respect. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." She tried to sit up, and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through her shoulder and thigh. Why? Why save you? Why have antidotes? Why make coffee for someone who tried to kill me? He poured 2 cups from a thermos, the mundane action somehow more unsettling than if he'd been pointing a gun at her. "Pick your question. All of them." Kane handed her a cup, and she noticed his hands were steady despite the bandage wrapped around his knuckles. "I've been expecting you or someone like you for 3 weeks. Corporate wet work teams don't just give up because their first attempt fails. As for why I saved you," he shrugged, "maybe I'm tired of being the only one who knows the truth. The coffee was good, real coffee, not the synthetic stuff she was used to. It struck her as absurd that she was having a civil conversation with a man she'd been hired to murder, but nothing about this situation followed any protocol she'd been trained for. Your employer didn't tell you what I actually uncovered, did they? Kane asked. I don't ask questions. It's healthier that way. Healthier for whom? He pulled up something on his laptop screen and turned it toward her. Helix Corporation isn't just manufacturing military contracts. They're running human experiments in Syria, Guatemala, and the Philippines. Battlefield testing of biological weapons on civilian populations. Despite herself, Lyra found herself reading the documents. Medical reports, photographs, financial records, evidence of atrocities that made her stomach turn. She'd killed for money, never for ideology. But this was different. This was genocide with a profit margin. The congressional hearing isn't for days, Kane continued. After that, none of this stays buried. Helix knows that, which is why they sent you. And now they'll send someone else, probably several someone else's. He closed the laptop. Which is why I'm offering you a deal. Lyra set down her coffee cup, every instinct screaming that she was about to cross a line she could never uncross. I'm listening. Help me get to that hearing alive, and I'll give you something worth more than whatever Helix is paying you. What could be worth more than my life? Kane's smile was sad and knowing. A chance to save it instead of ending others. Outside, thunder rolled across the Portland sky, and Lyra realized she was at a crossroads that had been years in the making. The assassin who never missed had finally found a target worth missing. 2 days in the abandoned mill had transformed it from a tomb into something resembling a fortress. Kane had shown her the exits he'd mapped, the supply caches he'd hidden, and the communication equipment he'd jury-rigged from salvaged electronics. More importantly, he'd shown her something she'd never seen before, what it looked like when someone fought for something instead of against everything. You don't sleep much, Lyra observed, watching him adjust the motion sensors he'd placed around the perimeter. Neither do you. He glanced at her from across the room where she was methodically checking her equipment. Bad dreams? She almost laughed. I don't dream. I plan. But that wasn't entirely true anymore. Last night, for the first time in years, she'd dreamed of something other than death. She'd dreamed of walking away from all of this. Though she couldn't quite picture what away might look like, Kane finished his work and sat down across from her, close enough that she could see the scar that ran along his jaw. Tell me about your first contract. Why? Because I told you about Syria. Because we're probably going to die together in the next 48 hours. Because I'm curious about the woman behind the legend. Lyra's hands stilled on her bow. No one had ever asked her that question. Not in 7 years of professional killing. I was 19, a politician in Sacramento who was asking too many questions about military contractors. They told me he was corrupt, that he was selling weapons to terrorists. She met Kane's eyes. He wasn't. How did you find out? I didn't. Not until years later. By then, I'd stopped caring about the truth behind the contracts. She resumed her equipment check, needing something to do with her hands. It's easier. That way. Easier than what? Than admitting you've become the thing you were running from. Kane was quiet for a long moment, and she wondered if she'd said too much. But when he spoke, his voice held no judgment. What were you running from? The question unlocked something she'd kept buried for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. Foster care, group homes, men who thought a scared 16-year-old girl was an easy target. Her laugh was bitter. Turns out I was wrong about who the easy targets were. Survival isn't a sin, Lyra. It was the first time he'd used her real name instead of her Cody name, and the sound of it in his voice did something dangerous to her chest. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Neither is redemption. He added softly. Before she could respond, the proximity alarm chimed. Kane was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with fluid grace. 3 vehicles moving fast. Looks like Helix got tired of waiting. Lyra joined him at the window, counting muzzle flashes in the darkness. 8, maybe 10 operators. Professional-grade equipment. She turned to him. There's still time for you to run. I can hold them off. Not happening. This isn't your fight anymore, Kane. You gave me the files. I can get them to the media if what? If you sacrifice yourself to save someone you met 3 days ago? He was already moving toward his gear. I've got news. For you, Nightshade. This stopped being about the files when you decided not to put another arrow in me while I was sleeping. I never decided that, didn't you? He paused in loading his rifle to look at her. Because I've been an easy target for 72 hours now, the realization hit her like cold water. He was right. She'd had a dozen opportunities to complete her original contract, and she hadn't taken any of them. Somewhere between the coffee and the conversation, between his steady hands and his sad smile, she'd stopped being an assassin and started being something else entirely, something that might actually be worth fighting for. The first explosion shook the building, raining dust from the ceiling. Kane checked his weapon one final time and looked at her. Ready, partner? Lyra knocked an arrow, not the neurotoxin this time, but a simple broadhead meant to wound rather than kill. Let's give them a fight they'll remember. The assault came in waves, professional and coordinated, exactly what Lyra would have expected from Helix's private military contractors. The first team tried to breach through the main floor while the second approached from the upper catwalks. They moved with military precision, but they made one crucial mistake. They expected to find a lone whistleblower, not a partnership between a former Special Forces operator and a master assassin. Kane had positioned himself in the old control room, its reinforced windows giving him clear sight lines across the mill floor. His rifle cracked with methodical precision, each shot carefully placed to disable rather than kill. Lyra moved like smoke through the maze of machinery below, her arrows finding gap between body armor plates, severing weapon straps, and sending attackers stumbling into Kane's line of fire. Two more coming up the east stairwell. Kane's voice crackled through the radio earpiece he'd given her. Lyra was already moving, using the old conveyor system as a highway through the shadows. She'd spent 3 days learning every inch of this place, and now it felt like an extension of her own body. The lead attacker never saw her coming. Her arrow took him in the shoulder, spinning him back into his partner and sending both of them tumbling down the metal stairs. Clear east, she reported, already moving toward the sound of footsteps from the west side. The battle lasted 20 minutes that felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, 6 of Helix's contractors were wounded and immobilized, zip-tied, with their own equipment. The other 4 had retreated, probably to regroup and call for reinforcements. Kane climbed down from the control room, his face grim. They'll be back with more people, military-grade equipment, maybe air support. How long do we have? Hour? Maybe 2. He surveyed the disabled attackers with professional detachment. These guys were just the advanced team, a test to see what kind of resistance they're facing. Lyra knelt beside one of the wounded men, checking his injuries. The arrow had gone through his shoulder cleanly, missing the major arteries. He'd live, though he wouldn't be holding a rifle anytime soon. We could run, she said without looking up. There are paths through the industrial district they won't know about. And go where? They'll just keep coming until they find me. Kane helped her bandage the man's wound despite the fact that he'd been trying to kill them minutes earlier. The hearing is tomorrow morning. If I'm not there, the files will still get out. You uploaded them to secure servers. Files can be discredited, hacked, disappeared. Testimony under oath is different. He stood, checking his rifle. I have to be there, Lyra. Too many people have died for this truth to stay buried. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something that made her chest tight. He wasn't just determined. He was at peace with whatever came next. This man who'd saved her life, who'd made her coffee and asked about her dreams, was prepared to die for strangers he'd never meet. Then we make our stand here, she said. You think I'm letting you face them alone after you made me that coffee? She tried for lightness, but her voice came out rough. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't do anything stupidly. Heroic. Kane's smile was worth everything she'd given up. Stupidly heroic is my specialty. They spent the next hour setting their defenses. Lyra rigged explosive arrows from the mill's old acetylene tanks, creating choke points that would funnel attackers into kill zones. Kane positioned himself with clear sight lines and prepared fallback positions. They worked in comfortable silence, each anticipating the other's movements like dancers who'd been partnered for years instead of days. As they waited for the final assault, Lyra found herself beside Kane in the shelter of an old furnace. I need to tell you something, she said. If this is a deathbed confession, I'd rather not hear it. I missed on purpose. The words came out in a rush. That first shot, I don't know why, but something made me hesitate. Kane turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. I know. You know? Lyra, You had a clear shot at my center mass from 30 yards with perfect conditions. The woman who killed Senator Morrison from 300 yards in a crosswind doesn't miss that shot by accident. She stared at him. Then why save me? Because you chose not to kill me. And because he reached out, his fingers brushing her hand. Because I was hoping I wasn't the only one who felt this. The sound of helicopters approaching cut through the night air, but for just a moment, all Lyra could hear was her own heartbeat and the quiet admission that changed everything. The second assault was everything the first wasn't: overwhelming, coordinated, and desperate. Helix had sent everything. They had 3 helicopter gunships, 2 full tactical teams, and enough firepower to level a city block. They came at dawn with the sun behind them, turning the mill into a war zone of smoke, sparks, and the endless chatter of automatic weapons. Kane's carefully planned defensive positions held for exactly 7 minutes before they were forced to fall back deeper into the mill's maze of machinery. Lyra's explosive arrows bought them precious seconds, collapsing walkways and creating barriers of twisted metal. But she was running out of tricks and they both knew it. North exit, Kane shouted over the noise, grabbing her hand as they ran. There's a storm drain that leads to the river. What about the hearing? What about staying alive? They emerged from the mill into gray Portland morning air that tasted like freedom and rain. Behind them, the building burned where Kane's improvised incendiaries had caught the helicopter fuel. They could hear shouting, orders being barked, the sound of pursuit organizing itself with military efficiency. The storm drain was exactly where Kane had said it would be, a concrete tunnel that smelled of rust and old water. They crawled through darkness toward the sound of the Willamette River, their hands finding each other in the blackness without conscious thought. When they finally emerged on the riverbank, soaked and shivering, the mill was a column of black smoke against the morning sky. Kane's phone had survived the dunking in its waterproof case, and he made 2 calls, one to his contact at the FBI, and one to a congressional aide who'd been waiting for 3 weeks to hear from him. The hearing's been moved to this afternoon, he said, ending the second call. Emergency session. They want my testimony before Helix can bury this any deeper. Lyra watched a tugboat push barges up the river, carrying cargo she couldn't identify, toward destinations she'd never see. It's over then. You won, Kane. We won. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one that made her feel like someone worth saving. Question is, what do we do now? She'd been thinking about that question for 3 days, ever since she'd first chosen not to kill him. The old Lyra would have disappeared by now, would already be planning her next identity, her next life in another city where nobody knew the name Nightshade. But the old Lyra had died in that mill, somewhere between the coffee and the conversation. Between the moment she'd decided to fight for something instead of against everything. I have some money saved, she said carefully. Enough to start over somewhere. Maybe buy a cabin in the mountains. Learn to do something with my hands that doesn't involve killing people. Sounds lonely. It would be. She turned to face him. Fully. Unless someone wanted to come with me. Someone who makes good coffee and asks about dreams. Kane's smile was answer enough, but he gave her words anyway. I know a place in Montana. My grandfather's cabin, right up against Glacier National Park. No cell service, no internet, just trees and mountains and all the peace two people could want. What about your testimony? Your crusade against corporate evil? Evil will still be there next month, next year. Right now, I'd rather focus on something good. He reached for her hand. Something real. 6 months later, Congressman Kane, he'd run for office on a platform of corporate accountability and won in a landslide, received a postcard from Glacier National Park. The front showed a pristine alpine lake surrounded by snow-capped peaks. The back contained only 3 words in handwriting he recognized: learning to breathe. He smiled and pinned it to his office wall next to a newspaper clipping about the Helix Corporation trials and a photo of himself giving his congressional testimony. But his favorite decoration was a simple wooden arrow, its point blunted and harmless, mounted in a frame with a small brass plaque that read, "The shot that saved us both." In the Montana wilderness, Lyra Chen was learning to hit targets that weren't human: paper bullseyes and old tin cans, nothing that bled or died or left families behind. Marcus Kane was learning to sleep through the night without checking the exits, to make coffee for 2 instead of 1, to believe in a future that stretched beyond the next crisis. Together, they were learning that sometimes the most dangerous shot is the one you choose not to take. And that redemption doesn't come from the lives you've ended, but from the life you decide to begin. The cabin had no cell service, no internet, and no connection to the world of contracts and conspiracies they'd left behind. It had something better: windows that looked out on forever, and the quiet satisfaction of two people who'd found their way home to each other through the darkest paths imaginable. Every morning, Lyra practiced her archery on targets that would never bleed. Every evening, Kane cooked dinner while she told him about the books she was reading, the dreams she was finally allowing herself to have. And every night, they fell asleep to the sound of wind through pine trees and the certain knowledge that they were finally, truly safe, not because the danger was gone, it never really was, but because they were no longer facing it alone.